We are sitting in the light studio, one of the two light studios at the Royal Danish Academy for Architecture, Design and Conservation, and where we conduct studies of light, but also other things. We also actually do teaching in these spaces. And so they are understood as very general and versatile spaces for both teaching and for research.
How many students do you have?
Oh, that varies depending on program, depending on module, so it varies a lot. But often we actually work here, you can say, with students in one-to-one hand or even or smaller groups. Yeah.
How old is the institute?
No, it's an old institution, but it has been it has gone from being a school of architecture. It has made a fusion together with the School of Design and School of Conservation, and for long it was three schools, you can say. But recently, a couple of years ago, you can say the school actually had a fusion 10, 12 years ago with the three schools, but it has been really formalized the last couple of years. So it's one academy now with different programs in architecture, design and conservation.
Fantastic. So Isak, I think you ought to introduce yourself and explain why you are here.
So, well, we're here because we've been asked to talk together. And I suppose we're here to try to discuss and find out what is it that triggers in terms of light and daylight, I mean, its relationship to how we work with the built environment, with architecture and design. And how we perhaps go about thinking about in terms of how it relates to humans, and for my sake, very much how it relates to materials also, and to space and time.
So how did you get to where you are now? I mean, what was the motivation? What was the interest? What were the triggers? As a youngster, well, of course you're still terribly young, but I mean, I mean,
I can say my background, I'm an educator as an architect and as an engineer.
Right. And
I had a course, or you can say of training that went through tectonics and architecture, which really deals with the relationship between material form and how we make things, fabrication in a kind of raw form. And I was very curious about how we do this in relationship to the environment. So how do we do that in relation to light, so thermal aspects, perhaps even acoustics. And for that reason, I started to investigate how can we construct things that modulate the environment and modulate light, for that sense, that we perceive. And that led me into an understanding or trying to investigate what I call environmental tectonics, or constructions that create an environment or modulate, transform an environment. And that then you could say branch into, among others, working with daylight. So I'm very, very curious about the relationships between materials, humans, and the environment, and those and how they are dynamic.
And I sense, as a non-architect, there's been a big shift, because humans are now being placed in the middle of architecture, rather than sort of, oh yeah, they'll occupy this space. And so in terms of design, in terms of, rather than just throwing energy at a particular problem to stabilize temperature or light or whatever, there's a very much more nuanced and dynamic relationship with humans and the built space. Is that fair?
That's fair to say. I think it's very true in the sense that also you can say that a lot of people working as architects or in designs, they work all from the kind of broad palette of things that they're looking at. And that points to kind of a generalist point of view, but also indicates that there must be some sort of a core understanding of some fields. And we say one of the things that we of course consider incredibly important is daylight. I mean, we have almost nothing without light, and we have very little understanding of the environment without light. And we use that in a sense also to, in some degree, to our advantage in order to allow buildings, architectures, to modulate a given context and make that visible or decipherable by humans.
I mean, it is extraordinary. I mean, all of our evolutionary history has been outside, except for the past, what, 150, 200 years. And so we've gone from, I think the statistics are that 95% of the population in 1800s were in agriculture in some form, so they were working outside. I think in the UK, it's been estimated that 1 to 2% of the population are in fisheries and agriculture. So we've gone from living in an outside space into an inside space. And what I think is so extraordinary is that across the age range, whether you're young or old, the amount of time that you spend outside has shrunk to, in some cases, no natural light or daylight exposure at all, which I think is extraordinary, really, when you think about the transition has been so rapid and what the consequences of that are. And the way that architecture now seems to be realizing that and embracing that. Whereas before it was, I mean, we were discussing just the other day that classrooms you know, kindergarten, for example, in North America, they didn't have windows in their rooms. And part of that was because, it's too difficult to organize, and teachers will open the windows and change things and disrupt the energy balance. There was that. But also what I hadn't appreciated is that these classrooms doubled as nuclear bunkers. And of course, you don't want big windows in a nuclear bunker. And so there's been fascinating drivers, particularly in North America. We've gone from those glorious great glass cathedrals that were used in the past for teaching to very odd spaces. And I think it's coming back again. I mean, I'm really excited by some of the nursing home or designs that I'm seeing for schools. Are you involved in that space? Yeah.
Yes, we did a very interesting study, I mean, to me interesting at least, a couple of years ago, where we were investigating the relationship between the development of teaching at the moment. It's not only about the building or the space or the materials, it's also about didactics, pedagogics, how do teachers actually teach nowadays. And that collided with the COVID situation of home teaching and outdoor teaching and these kind of events. And we asked in this project, we asked and interviewed teachers. And it was very interesting, the response, because typically we have an intention of bringing a certain light level into a space and maintaining a somber uniformity. What they talked about across all the different teachers we talked to was much more kind of a mood setting, working with the atmosphere, the control of the space in terms of learning conditions. And we were just amazed by the response that we got from, because they were very much reading the space when they got into it, reading the students, and then working with the condition of either dimming the light, opening up the space more. And in particular, this dynamics have become more important since a lot of people start to use screen teaching or teaching on people who look on screens. So this kind of dynamics is not only about this, you can say, the light that comes in, but also the eye relation to the screen, to the natural light. And the way that they were coordinating and working with that was, I would say, quite sophisticated compared to some of the things we investigate when we design. And that was very, very, very
so how have you been able to integrate those comments and what teachers say about their teaching experience and their sort of the environment that they want into the design? I mean, how do you interact with your clients in a sense?
Yeah, so some of those aspects I think come to a question of adaptation. So what do we want to have? What do we want to adapt in these situations? Do we want the building to adapt, or do we want the pupils to adapt? Do we want the teacher to adapt, and how are they correlated together? So some of the things we discussed was they install adaptive behavior in the sense that they move students outside, they move them to corridors, and what we tried to work with was adding a layer to the building which would allow that kind of adaptation of both the building but also the people in the space, because a lot of the spaces they had at the moment did not support adaptive behavior of the people. So that we empower, you can say, the ability for the people to actually understand, decode, and activate a behavior against that light condition, which they know the best because they're teaching at that. That's of course a very specified situation, because it's teaching. It will be something else in the training perhaps.
And within the context of sort of a dynamic light environment, to what extent are views, you know, we've got this stunning view behind us. I mean, and there's this sort of tension, which is, I don't want my pupils to be looking out of the window when I'm teaching, but given the opportunity, people love to look out of the window and get a sense of the view. Do you have that in your mind when you're building?
I would say we would probably not try to dispose of the possibility of the quality of daylight and the quality of kind of drifting away in thought and looking outside. There's quality in that. Reading the environment outside, they're all things we appreciate and things we should probably support. So I think it is more the ability to understand what is suitable for this environment and how can people use it in a way that is meaningful for what they want to do in that space. And in that sense, again, it comes down to how do we give the possibility for people to engage with the architecture and with the environment and with what they want to do at the same time. So again, it ties again, what is the human condition, what is the ability to sense the environment, what is the ability to modulate, and what is the locality and the time, which
so
is
it's
all
not
dynamic.
It's so dynamic, yes.
It's
That's what's
dynamic.
exciting, yeah.
And that makes me, of course, consider your field of study, because it seems to me, and I would like you to present and unfold some of that in a minute, but it seems to me that the kind of dynamics of reading an environment is attached to our ability to sense and our physiology. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I went to university thinking I'd become a marine biologist. Because I was a good swimmer and I love biology, so I thought, well, there you go, I'm going to become a marine biologist. And then in one of those early physiology laboratory practicals, we recorded the light responses from the eye of a locust. And I remember being completely overwhelmed with the fact that you stuck this sort of electrode on the eye and you turn the lights on and you increase the intensity and decrease the intensity and the size of the electroretinogram you got. And I just thought that was the beginning of my conversion from a marine biologist into a physiologist, and particularly somebody who was interested in the impact of light on biology across the range. So that was my first induction. And then for my third year project, I recorded from, again, the electrical activity of the third eye, this pineal eye in frog tadpoles. And it is extraordinary. Of course, they have these lateral eyes, and you can stick an electrode onto this little third eye. And again, it acts as this photoreceptor, which in that case was actually regulating swimming behavior. So it was like a shadow response. And that then led me into a PhD, which was trying to understand what the photoreceptors were that were measuring day length in birds. So as the day length increases in spring, that will trigger reproduction. And so, egg lay and chicks and all the rest of it. But the photoreceptors, the light sensors for that, are not in the eye. They're not in the pineal. They're actually within the brain itself. So light is being, passing through the feathers and the skull, and it's being integrated next to the receptors, next to the systems that are actually regulating reproduction. So that was my introduction to weird photoreceptors. And so then the next question was, well, how do mammals detect light to regulate the circadian system? So you have this internal clock, fine-tuning biology to the varied demands of the 24-hour day, the differences in the light-dark cycle, so anticipating dawn, so blood pressure is rising, metabolism is rising, we're getting ready for mobility and action. And of course, at the other end of the day, you're winding down and going into a different physiological state, which is sleep. Now, that beautiful fine-tuning of biology by this internal clock is of absolutely no adaptive value unless the internal day is set to the external world. And mammals only have light sensors within the eye. They don't have these pineal photoreceptors or photoreceptors elsewhere. And so the big tension for me was, well, how the heck can an eye, a visual sensory organ, which detects light in a fraction of a second and then forgets it's seen it, can then be used to detect the slow transient changes at dawn and dusk to regulate the clock. So that was the sort of the question. And so we decided to look at mice with hereditary retinal disorders, mice that were being used to study actually eye disease. The visual cells, the rods and the cones, had broken down because of genetic disease. So they were visually blind. And we thought, well, I wonder what the capability of these mice is in regulating the clock. And much to our amazement, these blind mice, they had their eyes, but they had no, or very few visual cells, could regulate their circadian system perfectly normally. And that was the beginnings to think, well, maybe mammals don't have an extra retinal photoreceptor, a weird photoreceptor in the pineal, but maybe they have a weird photoreceptor within the eye. Perhaps their extra retinal photoreceptors are within the eye. And to cut a long story short, we then just sort of, and others were part of the sort of a big interest in, and we discovered in mice, for example, that there's this additional photoreceptor system, this ganglion cell. Now, these are the cells in the retina that actually have their axons which go out and go into the brain. These ganglion cells form the optic nerve. But about 1 out of every 100 of those cells is directly light sensitive. And so this has led to a complete, understanding that the eye is both the organ of space, vision, but also the organ of time, because of its detection of the light-dark cycle and the regulation of the circadian system. So it has this wonderful dual function. That's led to changes in in clinical ophthalmology. So ophthalmologists have just assumed the eye just does one thing. And so there has been a tendency, it doesn't happen very often, but it's been, well, you know, you're blind, you've lost your rods and cones due to disease or whatever. I think the eye is of no use to you, so we'll remove it because it'll be a source of infection, and you know, we'll put a prosthetic in. And of course what they might unwittingly do is they've already lost their sense of space, but they then might lose their sense of time. So that's led to a difference in the way that the ophthalmologists are thinking about the importance of the eye. And what we've been doing most recently is then trying to understand that light input pathway into the brain, and can we use drugs that mimic the effects of light on the master clock within the brain. Understanding that pathway has given us some really important targets, and it's really exciting.
And how stable is this condition, you know, between people and between, you know, so because can we modulate? Let's say we can modulate that behavior, that mechanism.
I think that's the interesting, important thing, because we don't fully understand how light interacts with the circadian system. What we know is that it's the light intensity, the duration, the wavelength, the history, light history. So if you spent a day outside in bright light, your circadian system is less sensitive to light in the evening. We also know that if you've been sleep deprived, you change the effects of light on the clock. So the sleep systems and the circadian systems via light detection are talking to each other. And then it'll depend upon how old you are. Younger people their circadian system tends to be more sensitive than older people. And so trying to come up with recommendations about what we should be experiencing in the built environment is complicated, not least, of course, because light will have different effects at different times. Morning light will advance the clock, make you get up earlier and go to bed earlier, whereas dusk light will delay the clock, make you go to... So should we really be focusing our attention on morning and light exposure in the home and sort of ignoring really to some extent what's going on during the day? I don't think that's the case, but you know, we don't fully understand the parameters, and I think that's a big frustration, because when I've worked with architects, they say, tell me what I need to do, and we say, well, we can give you some hints and suggestions, but full empirical sort of studies from which recommendations can arise have not been completed yet. I mean, so for example...
Now you hit I'm sorry to engage here, but I mean, now you hit a nerve on kind of architects and designers, because they need to understand something, but they also need to project something, because they need to construct proposals. We propose something that is not yet out there. As differences study existing phenomena, they construct something that could become a phenomenon potentially. So one of my interests in this also, and the research that you conduct, is also, and some of the things that we're doing with these more advanced modeling of light, or simulation of daylight, is can we start to extract and understand some temporal phenomena, transient conditions in our investigation, design investigation, to enable a better projection, a better understanding of the impact of humans. So one of the things here is that we can take some of the research and then embed into the design simulation model, and then project how will this influence the circadian rhythm.
Well, I think that's...
Is this too far away?
No, I think that's really important, because what you, of course, have done have these wonderful modelling systems. And so what we need, I think, is scientists like myself and architects like yourself to work together and say, okay, let's try and tweak the model, and let's make some predictions that we can then go and test, because it is complicated. So, and I do think that, you know, my lot have not been particularly helpful. Because you know,
what do you remember that your lot?
my tribe, my circadian tribe, and those of us who work on the regulation of the clock by light. So how much light do you need to regulate the clock? And so there's lots of discussion about light in the evening, and so that 90 lux is about what you get in most domestic settings, and there have been studies based upon laboratory observations that 90 lux is enough to shift the clock, will delay the clock in the evening. And so that's led to sort of recommendations that you shouldn't see more than 40 lux 2 hours before you go to bed. Now, that's that's troublesome for me, because those studies in the lab where people were kept under dim light during the run-up to the studies, and then given 7 hours of light exposure. So you can get an effect if people have been deprived of light during the day, or spent time under dim light and then given 7 hours of light. Now that doesn't really relate to the real world, and other studies have shown that if you're given bright light during the day, those small effects of light in the evening are gone. And I think telling somebody that they should sit under 40 lux for 2 hours before they go to bed might be okay for a youngster, but if you are older and your vision has deteriorated to some extent, I think there's the chance of falls and other sorts of problems by living under such dim light conditions. So we don't have the full analysis, and the problem from our end is that people say, oh yeah, well, we've got these new photoreceptors, you know, we kind of know how it works, and the questions that architects ask we can't fully answer. And so there's I think a call to arms where architects and biologists like myself want to work together to try and find out, to develop evidence-based guidelines that we can put into our built spaces. Yeah.
I think that's obviously incredibly interesting, because it allows us to ask questions we otherwise cannot even get close to.
Yeah.
But it also, I think, entangles with how do we actually use buildings today. So yes, we are, but in the western part of the world, 90% of the time roughly inside. It doesn't really for the whole world, but the western part.
Yeah.
And then there's been some very interesting studies that looked at what do we actually spend our time with, and there was 90%. And so that's across the whole world. And one of the things that comes out of these studies is quite interesting to see that we're not that different across the world, actually. So there's a bulk of sleeping, and then there's a bulk of activities and jobs and other leisure. But a lot of these activities can actually happen closer to natural light. So obviously when we're sleeping, it's one condition. It's important for dimming up and down, of course, as you talk about. But perhaps also we need to consider some of the things that we do are naturally closer to natural light. So the way that we organize people's location is in much closer proximity, even if it's an inside, you can say, a facade, that is much more in relationship to that natural light.
Yeah.
So there's an entanglement, you can say, of what happens outside, what happens with the buildings, what happens with the people, that seems to be in a much more kind of complex, you can say, and temporal condition, rather than the more static metrics that we use today that describe we need a certain daylight factor across the year, because it doesn't really represent anything.
No, and of course you raise the seasons, and the expanding and contracting, day length is going to have a big impact upon the light environment, next to a window, for example. And how does that impact? No, I think yes, you're absolutely right. Those dynamic aspects are so important. But just one thing you said about time outside versus inside, and there's some very interesting observations in children growing up in Asian countries like Singapore, for example, where the rise in myopia over the past, which is short-sightedness, has risen from, I think, about 30% to 80 or 90% in some cases. And the data emerging are that it's time spent outside under bright light conditions that can have a big influence on the development of the eye and its axis, and whether you're likely to become short-sighted or not. And some fascinating studies have looked at the relationship between myopia and light exposure. And I was lucky enough to go to a presentation by an Australian scientist fairly recently, and talked about two sets of data. One was the correlation between skin cancer and myopia. And they found that people who had skin cancer had very low levels of myopia, indicating that they spent a lot of time outside. And also vitamin D synthesis. I don't think vitamin D levels are responsible for myopia, but they give you a metric of light exposure. And again, high levels of vitamin D were associated with lower levels of myopia as a measure of how much light you've received outside. And it's those sorts of things. Now, do we want to try and do something about that within the built environment, or we just say, no, the built environment is not suitable for this. You need to budget a couple of hours outside every day to deal with that. And so I suppose it's that tension of trying to replicate in the built environment what we would normally see outside, versus, you know, no, this is where the built environment stops, and you actually need to get outside. I think that's also, I think, a fascinating area of future research.
I'm also curious about this relationship with what can be generalized across an understanding of a population, or what we need to look more at kind of specificity of people.
That's a good
and
point.
some of the things that we're looking at is we have a quite big range of both interests, of people's response to light, or their interest in it, or the program. And some of the things we deal with is to balance about unforeseen events, and if it becomes too specific what we design, create, it does not match a broader segment, and therefore it becomes not robust, and potentially also not sustainable. So how do you see kind of this relationship between understanding and using the specific understanding of the subject versus the understanding of the population? Is there an issue there?
Well, there are, and you raise an extremely important point, which is biological variability. How can we use average values in a meaningful way in a highly dynamic situation? And what's the answer to that? I'm not sure. I mean, as a scientist, you just say more research. But I think where there's a real opportunity for collaboration is with modeling, because you can change the parameters, you can then work out and then make some predictions and then test those predictions, rather than going out and testing everything and exploring everything, which is economically impossible. You can make some very targeted studies, and that's where I think there's some real excitement between the architectural community, in particular people like yourself, you know, who can model the built environment and how it interacts with the natural environment, such as light and sound, and what we will perceive as being important for the biology of the individual.
Because we see some of the studies that we sometimes conduct that we can get average metrics that are suitable, but we get in a morning time completely useless light condition for the program that is intended, and in the afternoon the reverse, but we have a flat line that says it's fine. So this starts to discuss also what kind of information do we convey in these processes, how do we communicate it, and how do we explore it. So because we see an increasing amount of data.
The situation is highly dynamic. We know what the factors are, but we don't know how they interact. I mean, one of the approaches, which again I think you'll find interesting, is I was told that they have modeled the entire sort of physical landscape of the UK and are using that information to work out what particular acoustic problems might occur in particular locations. So I thought that was interesting. When I asked the question, well, have you validated the model? They said, oh, it's unnecessary. That worried me just a little bit. And I wonder what your thoughts are on validation of models.
Obviously, this is a core part of creating successful and reliable projections. So we are if we move into discussion of modeling and simulation, this is a very central in a lot of things what is happening at the moment, and it's developing quite a lot, especially with the new techniques that comes out in terms of increased pace of some machine learning models, for instance. But there's a question of precision and accuracy in some of the models. And that's quite for debate, you know, because if we look at a typical trade-off has been, let's say 10, 15 years, 20 years ago, especially when we had different kind of computing power, it was a strong trade-off between speed of execution, how fast can you do it? Do you want to wait 2 weeks for a simulation to run through? Then the project is already getting built over there. or can you rely on a bit lower precision, but then being formed at a certain state? So this kind of level of information and understanding when to engage with it is meaningful still, you know. So at what level of action do we need what level of information? Always, of course, we're interested in the high levels of accuracy. But if that accuracy takes so long that it cannot be embedded, then it's a challenge. So there are some models in which we can talk about them, and talking to software developers of acoustics is that how do we develop potentially models that engage with the level in which we take decision. So if it's a fast iterative design process in the beginning, then it doesn't work. Then it will be omitted if it's not something that can act as an analysis part, even if we know the accuracy is lower. And then we build accuracy as we go ahead. But there is always a question, of course, about validation and verification of the model. So those two are, of course, interchanged with each other and should be.
So we've talked a lot about multidisciplinarity.
Yeah.
And in the course of our conversation, it's got even more. You know, we thought just biologists and architects chatting, and we've talked now about psychology, we've talked about socioeconomics, we've talked about government departments. We've talked about mathematical modelling. How are we going to bring all of these various sectors together to make a difference in the built environment? What are your thoughts?
I don't know.
You know, I thought you might say that.
We had in a forum of architects, engineers, and designers a discussion around about daylight. Yeah. And one of the questions was, okay, we have a quite good representation of people actors who develop the daylight environment around people. The problem is that a lot of these actions are constrained, or they are influenced by legislation, or by other forms of action. So one of the questions was also, do we actually need to bring politicians into this discussion? Do they understand the importance of these things? And there's no yes or no answer to that. Was at least what emerged from it, because when to engage meaningfully depends also very much on the person, even if it's in politics or something, who can engage with that conversation.
Which is very difficult. I mean, the problem with the political world is that I was given some interesting advice, which is that don't try and engage with a minister. They're too busy, and they move all the time. So you start developing a project with a senior member of the government, and you engage with their civil servants, and then they get, you know, after 18 months, they're moved on to another post, and the whole project dies. So you engage with backbenchers, people who are interested, and they will have the capacity to engage, which I thought was interesting. But what was interesting about the report, incidentally, that came out, we called light and noise the neglected pollutants, because while we have legislation relating to asbestos or whatever, we don't have that kind of legislation for light and noise, which I think was really interesting, because it's basically not taken very seriously. And I think it's changing. I think it's coming up on the agenda, but not perhaps fast enough.
I think there's also something to do with interest. I mean, because we can see the disciplines that we need to engage, and we have several projects where we have very multidisciplinary constellations, consortiums. But that doesn't mean that the interest is the same. No. So what we see sometimes, some projects, is that we go into a project, we develop it, and we work towards what we think is a common goal, but that doesn't mean that the interest is the same. So it's because there is in all projects a disciplinary interest, and there's a shared interest. And I think this is something we have just started to be much more kind of aware of, in what kind of ways can we collaborate meaningfully, but where we also allow people to have self-interest in these projects, because otherwise we start to have
so important.
Otherwise, sometimes we see that this is actually not a functioning multidisciplinary collaboration. So in that way, also in a sense, we have to, as a discipline, also grow, not just the path in between us. So and I think this is something we are attempting to be much more clear on when we start collaboration. What is it actually we achieve? What is our shared ambition? What is our individual ambition in this? And maybe they fully collide or fully kind of entangle, but more often than not, it turns out that there are kind of other interests that is also part of a shared project.
I think that's so interesting that you go in with a defined set of objectives and expectations, because we don't often. You think, wouldn't it be nice to sit down with a bunch of people and somehow magically coherence will arise? And of course it won't, unless you have the structure that I think you've outlined.
I think we are. I wouldn't say we're necessarily fully successful yet, but we are aware of it, and we are trying to install ways of working together so we extract most out of the project.
So you're shuffling forward in the right direction, rather than leaping gazelle-like.
Also, positive forward feedback is a good thing. You know, you bring people front that you know they have a certain competence, and then ask how are they engaged and how do we engage meaningfully in this together. So I think we are in a position where we need to collaborate, but we also need to collaborate meaningfully and in the time that we have. for it, and that is, I think that sometimes is more important than
Well, there's another tension, because of course you can collaborate and be fairly inward-looking. You know, these are people you know, and you know working together will work, versus a much broader national, international collaboration, where you can draw on greater expertise and greater resources, but perhaps it becomes unwieldy. And it's getting the balance, I think, between a coherent group of individuals versus an international consortium, network. Yeah. I mean, what's your experience of working internationally?
Oh, I really appreciate it. I really enjoy it, but internationally doesn't mean big for me. I mean, like a group of 3-4 partners is often quite ideal. Yeah. But now we're moving into a little bit kind of project organization structure to get towards an kind of ambition or aim, you can say. But it seems like there are also different kind of researchers. I'm a researcher who likes to do research, and there's also researchers who like to manage research. And so if one wants to be engaged in the research, then it requires that one also puts time aside for it. And that requires that there is someone who also manage sometimes, or that the project team is relatively compact and it's well understood how one works together, to remove some of that time that is spent on not doing research, because that's basically what we are there for, and that's what we should do. Yeah. So I think how we get into these meaningful relationships that moves us really forward together. And so we want to work together. We need to work together. But how do we do it in the most effective way? Is a bad word, but kind of a meaningful and impactful way. That I'm interested in.
That's actually really exciting, because I think we are thinking about getting a light consortia together in the UK under one of the government departments to try and bring lots of people together. And what's very clear is that the first meeting should be, what are your expectations? What do you want to get out of this meeting? And are we missing any expertise? Are we coherent? And I think that's a really important point for me.
There's one caveat in this, and that's something one has to be aware of, is that it doesn't become an echo chamber. So it's not a group of yays there, it's just support. There has to be some sort of friction, obviously, installed. Yes. So it is not just echo development. So, and I worked, and as an example, I was by an architectural office in Barcelona when I studied there, and they and more or less all their projects, they said that they bring someone in from the outside. They ask questions they would never ask. Yeah. Even though they were not fit for it or they didn't like it, it was a way to rephrase, re-question, to challenge the group. Yeah? And that seems to be a very kind of effective way sometimes to do that. But it has to be kind of I think the working group has to be able to develop forwardly with shared interests to develop something successful. Yeah.
And I guess we could develop some models that could be useful. So for example, if we're going to produce a consortia on light, what are the key things that we would want to define right from the beginning, and what do the different sectors need? So maybe the time is right. I think I sense a workshop coming on.
I sense a collaboration.
Yes.